Ever wonder what it was really like to live in the Middle Ages? Forget the romantic tales of knights and castles for a moment. Let's talk about the gritty reality of law and order back then. It was a world vastly different from ours, where survival was a daily struggle. Imagine a society with very limited education. Most people couldn't read or write. News traveled at the speed of a horse, or even just a person on foot. This meant information was slow, often distorted, and rumors spread like wildfire. There were no instant news alerts, no way to quickly verify a story. This created a constant state of uncertainty. On top of that, medical care was incredibly basic. A simple infection could be a death sentence, and plagues could wipe out huge portions of the population. Life was fragile, and this fragility bred a deep-seated fear. People were afraid of everything: disease, famine, and of course, crime. But how did they deal with crime? Well, there was no unified police force like we have today. No detectives in trench coats solving mysteries. Instead, you had a patchwork of authorities. The king had his laws, local lords had theirs, and the church had its own courts. It was a confusing and often contradictory system. If you were a victim of a crime, your first challenge was figuring out who was even in charge of helping you. In many places, communities were expected to police themselves. This was called the hue and cry. If someone witnessed a crime, they were supposed to shout and raise the alarm. Everyone within earshot had to drop what they were doing and chase the suspect. If you didn't join the chase, you could be fined yourself. It was a system built on collective responsibility. But you can imagine how chaotic it could be. Without a dedicated police force, maintaining order was a constant struggle. Local lords relied on their sheriffs and bailiffs, but their reach was limited. Many areas, especially dense forests and remote countrysides, became havens for outlaws and bandits. Traveling alone was incredibly dangerous. People usually traveled in groups or with armed escorts for protection. So, with all this fear and a weak system for catching criminals, how did leaders try to maintain control? They believed the answer was harsh punishment. The goal wasn't just to punish the individual, but to make a terrifying example for everyone else. They thought that extreme public punishments would deter others from breaking the law. Punishments were often brutal and performed in public squares for all to see. Things like the stocks and the pillory were common for minor offenses. People would be locked in place for hours, or even days, subject to public ridicule and abuse. People might throw rotten food or even rocks at them. For more serious crimes, the penalties were much, much worse. Flogging, branding with hot irons, and mutilation like cutting off a hand or an ear were all on the table. The idea was to permanently mark the person as a criminal, and for the most severe crimes, like treason or murder, the death penalty was the standard, and it was often carried out in gruesome ways. These public spectacles were designed to instill fear and reinforce the power of the authorities. Did it work? It's debatable. While the fear of such punishments might have deterred some, it didn't solve the root causes of crime, like poverty and desperation. In a world where starvation was a real threat, the risk of getting caught stealing a loaf of bread might seem worth it. This system of fear and brutal punishment lasted for centuries. It was a reflection of a society grappling with immense challenges: slow communication, limited resources, and a constant sense of vulnerability. They did what they thought was necessary to create a semblance of safety in a very dangerous world. It gives you a whole new perspective on our own modern systems of justice, doesn't it? Have you ever wondered why torture was so common throughout history? It seems barbaric to us now, but for centuries, it was a completely normal part of the justice system. The core idea was surprisingly simple, though deeply flawed. People believed that intense pain could force a person to tell the truth. It was seen as the ultimate lie detector. In many historical legal systems, a confession was the queen of proofs. It was considered more valuable than any other form of evidence. Think about it. Without modern forensics like DNA testing or fingerprinting, what could be more definitive than the accused admitting their guilt? The entire system was built around getting that confession, and torture was the tool they used to get it. They thought that under enough physical agony, a person's will to lie would break, and the pure, unvarnished truth would spill out. This belief was so ingrained that few people questioned it. The authorities, the church, the state, the inquisitors were seen as instruments of divine or legal truth. Challenging their methods was like challenging the very foundations of society and justice. The average person was taught to trust the system, and the system said torture worked. It created a powerful, self-reinforcing cycle. But let's look at the psychology behind it. Does pain really lead to truth? Modern science tells us the exact opposite. Extreme pain and stress don't clarify the mind. They shatter it. Under duress, people will say anything to make the pain stop. They'll confess to crimes they didn't commit, name innocent accomplices, or agree to whatever story their torturers want to hear. The truth extracted was often just a reflection of the interrogator's own beliefs and suspicions. Imagine being in that situation. You're accused of a crime. You're innocent, but you're being subjected to unimaginable pain. Day after day. At some point, the instinct for survival takes over. The desire to end the suffering becomes more powerful than the desire to maintain your innocence. A false confession becomes irrational, just their only way out. So, ironically, the very tool they used to find truth was actually a factory for lies. This led to countless wrongful convictions and tragic miscarriages of justice. People were condemned based on words forced out of them in moments of desperation. The system wasn't finding criminals, it was creating them. The confessions obtained through torture tell us less about the guilt of the accused and more about the limits of human endurance. The shift away from torture wasn't just a moral awakening, it was also a logical one. Thinkers during the Enlightenment began to argue that a system based on cruelty was not only inhumane but also ineffective and irrational. They championed reason, evidence, and the idea that a person is innocent until proven guilty. This new way of thinking slowly dismantled the old justifications for torture. Today, the global consensus, codified in international law, is that torture is an absolute wrong. It's a violation of fundamental human dignity. We've learned the hard way that you unbuild a just society on a foundation of pain and fear. The quest for truth requires reason, evidence, and empathy, not the rack and the thumbscrew. It's a sobering lesson from our past, reminding us why protecting human rights is so. Have you ever wondered why old town squares often featured a pillory or a scaffold? It wasn't just for punishing criminals. It was a powerful message to everyone who watched. This is the story of how fear, deliberately and publicly staged, became one of the most effective tools of political control in history. Let's travel back in time. Imagine a bustling medieval marketplace. Suddenly, the crowd parts. A person, accused of a crime, is dragged to the center. What follows isn't a private affair. It's a public spectacle. The punishment, whether it's the stocks, a whipping, or something far more severe, is performed for all to see. Children, merchants, farmers, everyone becomes an audience. The screams, the pleas, the visible suffering, it was all part of the show. Why go to all this trouble? The goal wasn't just to punish one person. It was to terrify 1,000. The message was brutally simple. This could be you. This is what happens when you step out of line. The memory of that suffering would linger long after the event was over. Every time someone thought about breaking a rule, stealing a loaf of bread, or speaking out against a lord, that vivid image of public humiliation and pain would flash in their mind. It was a psychological chain, far more effective than any physical wall or guard. This method wasn't unique to medieval Europe. Throughout history and across cultures, rulers have understood the power of performative cruelty. From the Roman crucifixions lining the Appian Way to the public denunciations during the Cultural Revolution, the pattern is the same. The individual's suffering is amplified to create collective anxiety. Fear becomes the invisible enforcer of the law. It discourages dissent, not through reasoned argument, but through raw, primal emotion. This strategy created a culture of obedience. When people are afraid, they are less likely to question authority. They become more focused on their own survival, on simply not becoming the next person in the stocks. This fear isolates individuals. You might be angry about injustice, but you'd be too scared to talk to your neighbor about it, worried they might report you. This breakdown of social trust is exactly what a controlling regime wants. It prevents people from organizing, from realizing they share the same grievance. But here's the interesting twist in this dark history. This strategy has a critical weakness. It can backfire. There's a fine line between creating fear and creating martyrs. Sometimes, a public punishment doesn't terrify the crowd. It enrages. That when the punishment is seen as unjust or excessively cruel, the victim can become a symbol of defiance. The spectacle designed to enforce control can instead ignite the very rebellion it was meant to prevent. The crowd's fear can curdle into anger, and that anger can be a far more powerful force. Think about it. Many revolutions were sparked by a public act of brutality that went too far. The story shifts from a warning about obedience to a rallying cry for freedom. The state's greatest weapon, public fear, suddenly becomes its greatest liability. The people, once a terrified audience, transform into a unified force for change. So, the history of public punishment is really a story about the delicate and dangerous balance of power. It shows how fear can be weaponized to control populations, but it also reminds us of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. The desire for justice and dignity can, in the end, overcome the deepest fears. The empty scaffolds in our modern town squares aren't just relics. They're monuments to the moment when people decided they would no longer be ruled by fear. What do you think? Have you seen examples of this? Picture this. A bustling town square, not for a market day or a festival, but for a spectacle of a very different kind. The scaffold stands tall in the center, and the crowd isn't here for entertainment in the way we know it. They're here to witness a punishment. This was a common scene for centuries, a chillingly normal part of life that shaped societies in ways we're still unpacking today. This wasn't just about justice. It was about public theater, and everyone had a front row seat. Let's journey back in time, to an era where justice was not only served, but performed. Public punishments, from the stocks and pillory to more severe and brutal sentences, were designed to be seen. The core idea was deterrence. By making an example of one person, the authorities hoped to scare everyone else into obedience. It was a raw, visceral display of power. The message was simple and brutal. Step out of line, and this could be you. The crowd wasn't just a passive audience. They were active participants. They would cheer, jeer, and sometimes even throw rotten fruit or stones. It was a way for the community to collectively express its outrage and reinforce its moral boundaries. What's truly fascinating and deeply disturbing is who was in that crowd. It wasn't just adults. Children were often present, sometimes even brought by their parents as a grim life lesson. Imagine growing up seeing this level of violence as a regular part of your community life. This normalization of brutality had profound psychological effects. For some, it might have been a terrifying deterrent. For others, it could have desensitized them, making violence seem like a legitimate solution to problems or a standard part of human interaction. The line between justice and cruelty became incredibly blurred. These public events were also a form of social control that went beyond just punishing a crime. They reinforced the existing power structures. The judge, the executioner, the town guard, they were all actors on a stage, demonstrating the state's authority. For the common person, watching a fellow citizen, perhaps even a neighbor, being subjected to such humiliation or pain was a stark reminder of their place in the social hierarchy. It was a way to keep the population in check, not just through fear of the law, but through a constant, visible reminder of the consequences of defiance. Think about the ripple effects. Generations grew up in this environment. It influenced everything from parenting styles to community disputes. When public violence is sanctioned by the state, it can subtly seep into the fabric of everyday life. Did this create a more orderly society, as intended? Or did it create a society that was more callous, more prone to its own forms of casual cruelty? Historians and sociologists still debate these questions. The evidence suggests it was a complex mix of both. While it may have suppressed certain types of crime, it also cultivated a certain hardness in the human spirit. These spectacles didn't just disappear overnight. The shift away from public punishment was a slow, gradual process, tied to the Enlightenment and new ideas about human dignity, justice, and the purpose of a legal system. Thinkers began to argue that punishment should be about reform, not just retribution. The focus moved from the body to the mind, and the prison cell replaced the public square as the primary symbol of justice. This change marked a massive shift in how society viewed itself and its members. It was a move towards a more private, less theatrical form of justice, one that happens behind closed doors. So, the next time you see a depiction of a medieval town square in a movie, Remember, it was more than just a marketplace. It was a stage for the raw drama of life and law, a place where justice, power, and public spectacle collided. The echoes of those crowds and the lessons they learned or failed to learn are still with us, hidden in the foundations of our modern legal systems and our collective attitudes towards crime and punishment. It's a powerful reminder of how far we've come, and a cautionary tale about the fine line between order and brutality. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a darker side of history. Ever wondered how our modern justice system came to be? Let's take a journey back in time, to a world where the lines between law and faith were not just blurred, but completely intertwined. We're talking about the era of religious courts, where a crime wasn't just a violation of man's law, but a stain on the soul itself. Imagine this. You've done something wrong, something the community and the church condemn. Today, you'd face a judge, maybe a jury, and the law would be applied. But back then, the courtroom was also a place of spiritual reckoning. The judges, often clergymen, weren't just concerned with upholding social order. They were deeply concerned with the state of your eternal soul. This single, powerful idea changed everything about how justice was delivered. In Tirbu, every transgression, every sin, created a kind of spiritual debt. It was a corruption that needed to be purified. And how was this purification achieved? Through punishment. This is a critical point to understand. Punishment wasn't seen merely as a deterrent to others, or as a way to get retribution. It was seen as a form of medicine for the soul. A painful but necessary process to cleanse the sin and restore the individual to a state of grace. It was, in a sense, a form of penance enacted by the court. This belief system gave rise to a fascinating and complex legal culture. The goal wasn't just to make the offender pay for their crime in a worldly sense, but to guide them back to the path of righteousness. The court proceedings themselves often took on a deeply ritualistic character, blending legal procedure with religious ceremony. The entire process was designed to bring the offender to a point of true repentance. And that brings us to the crucial role of confession. In our modern legal framework, a confession is a piece of evidence, a powerful one, but still just one part of the puzzle. In the world of religious courts, confession was the gateway to salvation. It was the first and most important step in the soul's healing process. A voluntary confession was seen as a sign of genuine remorse, a willingness to confront one's sin and accept the consequences. It was the moment the accused person stopped fighting the earthly court and began to cooperate with the divine order. Think about the psychological weight of this. The court wasn't just asking you to admit to a crime. It was asking you to bare your soul, to acknowledge your moral failing before God and the community. This act of confessing was believed to have a powerful purifying effect in and of itself. It was the moment the spiritual healing could truly begin. Therefore, the legal system was structured to encourage it, sometimes through spiritual persuasion, and at other times, through more coercive means we'd find deeply troubling today. The verdict and sentencing were then tailored to this spiritual diagnosis. A person who confessed willingly and showed sincere remorse might receive a punishment designed to be more corrective than purely punitive. This could involve public prayers, pilgrimages, or charitable works. Actions meant to actively repair the spiritual damage. The punishment was a prescription for their spiritual sickness. On the other hand, someone who remained defiant, who refused to confess, was seen as being in a state of spiritual peril. Their refusal wasn't just a legal strategy. It was seen as a sign of a hardened heart, a rejection of God's mercy. Consequently, the punishments for the unrepentant could be far harsher because the court believed it had a duty to use whatever means necessary to break through that defiance and save the soul, even if the body had to suffer immensely in the process. This unique fusion of law and theology created a justice system unlike any other. It was a world where a judge was also a spiritual guide, a courtroom was also a confessional, and a sentence was also a prescription for the soul. While we have since separated the court from the church, understanding this history gives us a profound insight into the roots of our own concepts of justice, guilt, and redemption. It reminds us that for centuries, the ultimate goal of the law wasn't just to punish the crime, but to save the soul. Ever wonder what it was really like to get injured in the past? We're talking before our modern understanding of medicine. Forget what you see in the movies. The reality was often much grimmer. Today, We're diving into the history of medicine to see just how far we've come. It is a journey that will make you incredibly grateful for the doctors and nurses we have today. Imagine living in a world where the simplest cut could be a death sentence. For most of human history, that was the reality. Doctors, or what passed for them, had very little understanding of what we now call germs. The concept of infection was a complete mystery. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. So, when someone got injured, the biggest threat wasn't always the injury itself, but the invisible invaders that came after. A wound might be stitched up with a dirty needle and thread, pushing bacteria deep into the tissue. Without antibiotics, a small infection could quickly spiral out of control, leading to sepsis, gangrene, and a slow, painful end. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? The things we treat with a simple cream today were once life-threatening crises. And what about more serious injuries, like a broken bone or a deep wound from an accident or a battle? The treatments were, to put it mildly, brutal. Before the invention of effective anesthesia, surgery was an agonizing ordeal. Patients were often held down while a surgeon worked as quickly as possible, which, as you can imagine, didn't always lead to the most precise outcomes. Amputation was a common solution for severely damaged limbs to prevent the spread of what they called While it could save a life, it was performed in unsanitary conditions, meaning the risk of post-operative infection was many who survived the surgery itself would succumb to infection days or weeks later. Then there's the nervous system. The intricate web that controls everything in our body was a complete enigma. Doctors knew that damaging the head or spine was serious, but they didn't understand why. They had no concept of nerve signals or brain function as we do now. A severe blow to the head could cause a concussion or internal bleeding, but without CT scans or MRAs, there was no way to know the extent of the damage. People with spinal injuries were often left paralyzed, with little hope for recovery or even understanding of their condition. They were simply considered crippled, and often faced a life of hardship and dependency. Nerve damage in a limb, something we can now sometimes repair with microsurgery, would have meant a loss of function for life. The long-term consequences of these injuries were devastating. A soldier might survive a battle with a wound, only to suffer 4 years from chronic pain, recurring infections, or a limb that never healed properly. A farmer who broke his leg might end up with a permanent limp, unable to work his fields and provide for his family. These weren't just medical problems. They were social and economic disasters for individuals and their communities. Lifelong disability was an incredibly common outcome for injuries that we would consider very treatable today. People carried the physical and invisible scars of their injuries for the rest of their lives, which were often cut short by complications years down the road. Thinking about this history isn't meant to be morbid. It's about appreciating the incredible progress we've made, from understanding germ theory to developing antibiotics, anesthesia, advanced surgical techniques, and neuroimaging. Modern medicine has transformed our ability to heal. We can now fight infections, set bones with precision, and even begin to understand and repair the nervous system. It's a testament to centuries of scientific curiosity, dedication, and countless breakthroughs. The next time you get a cut and reach for an antiseptic wipe, take a moment to be thankful. We're living in a medical golden age that our ancestors could only have dreamed of. Thanks for joining me on this look back through medical history. If you found this fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the world around us. See you in the next video.